Good morning. I'm Bo Fagan, President of Republic Title of Texas, and I just want to welcome and thank everyone for joining us for today's program. We originally tried to schedule this program for back in late May or early April, but a little thing known as Corona came along, and we had to we had to delay it for some time. Which now we're very pleased that we have. I know that a lot of you, as well as myself, have sat on countless amount of webinars by economists telling you, what the economy is doing. But, we're very pleased today to have Kurt Pfotenhauer with our parent company, First American, join us to talk about the upcoming election and just what role politics actually plays on the economy, on our employment, and the real estate market. At the end of Kurt's presentation today, we want to hold a Q&A session. So if you have any questions you want to ask, please enter it in the chat feature that's located at the right-hand corner of your screen. At the end of Kurt's presentation, John Wilson of our office will come on and have a Q&A with Kurt based on those submitted questions. Now, please help me welcome Kurt Pfotenhauer. Kurt, you come on.
Hey, Bo, good to be with you today.
Yeah, good to have you. I want to give these people a little color why we wanted you to give this presentation and let them know why we're so excited that you're going to be the one presenting this material today. So let me get started with Kurt's responsibilities at First American. They include running the economic group and managing the company's executive level relationship with the company's largest clients, the U.S. Congress and the executive branch. Prior to joining First American, Kurt served as Chief Executive Officer of the Washington, D.C.-based American Land Title Association. Prior to joining ALTA, Kurt served as Senior Vice President of Government Affairs of the Mortgage Bankers Association, where he was twice named one of Washington's top lobbyists. Excuse me. He previously served as Chief of Staff for Senator Gordon Smith and Representative Denny Smith, and was Vice President of Public Affairs for the United Parcel Service. Kurt holds a master's degree from Yale University and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Notre Dame. Welcome, Kurt, and we look forward to hearing what you're saying. I'll let you take it from here.
Well, thank you, Bo. I wish I had a chance to be with all of you in person, to see you, to get your reactions as I'm prepared to give you some thoughts on the current day. I'm just going to warn you all in advance. I've been doing a lot of reading lately, a lot of thinking. My degrees, while all of my experience, most of my professional experience has been in politics. My degrees are actually in history and philosophy and theology, and I've learned a lot of practicum along the way, and I've been thinking about this opportunity to speak to you for a long time, and I'm going to meld some things together that should not dissuade you from asking really interesting, current, nitty-gritty questions. But I'm going to try to give you a wide aperture view of things because I think we're really at a very important moment in history. So let me. It's often been observed in the political circles that I run that where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit. And I'm one who subscribes to the notion that culture is actually upstream from our politics, and that large unseen trends often move culture and therefore politics. So we're going to start with the wide historical lens I promised and capture a few of these big trends and then narrow things down to look at the current polls and the economy, which is often a reliable predictor of election outcomes. By the end of this presentation, I hope to have offered you a perspective that helps you look at our current political environment a little differently, regardless of your political affiliation. So with your indulgence and patience, I'm going to open history's door first, where since the beginning of the Enlightenment in the late 17th century, for you historians, humans have been struggling with a difficult philosophical problem. It's one that influences our institutions, our expectations, and our aspirations. The problem is this, namely, how do we replace God? It was German existentialist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche who famously declared God dead, putting in his place the Übermensch, who through exercise of superior will could move nations in history, as one of his admirers, Adolf Hitler, certainly did in his day. To boil down the problem, once there is no creator, we lose our appeal to any source of objective truth. And we lose heaven as a place where human beings reach perfection and fulfillment. Put another way, once God is dead, it falls to human beings to find their own truth and to seek their own perfection. It's against this philosophical backdrop that you have to view the great American experiment, our country. Our founders, while not all religious men, were at least considered deists. They may not have believed in a personal God, but they believed that there was a creator. In addition, the population that fled Europe to the New World was often fleeing religious persecution and brought with them a strong belief in God and a culture rooted in Judeo-Christian precepts. Let's look at one of the most important founding statements of our country. From the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice the philosophical assumptions in that statement. There is a creator, and as a result, there is a discernible, even self-evident truth about how and for what purpose the creator made people. At its founding, America was not a nation that believed that you had your truth and I had mine. Nor would its founders have subscribed to the belief that human beings are progressing morally. They would not have understood the concept of being on the right or wrong side of history. They were instead trying to solve for the predicament that there would always be good and evil present in individuals, in society, and in its institutions. They believed that people were not morally perfectible, but that they could make a better society than the world had known to date. Until the American founding, nations were formed from bloodlines. They were extensions of tribes. The French were French, the Germans were Germans. These tribes, these nations were then enlarged through conquest. The king was the source of all sovereignty and often himself considered divine. At America's founding, we created the first creedal nation, a nation based on a creed in the history of our world. We declared a set of shared beliefs and then invited those, all of whom were immigrants from other countries, from other bloodlines, we invited those who shared our beliefs to join us in building a nation. Rather than seeing authority as derived from the king, authority to form a government was with the consent and from the consent of the governed. So government existed, and remember, government at its essence is a monopoly on the use of force. Government existed to protect the peace so that people might pursue life, liberty, and happiness on their own terms. Again, the founders rejected the idea that humans were in any way morally perfectible. In fact, they feared the tyranny of the majority and built a system of governmental checks and balances in the hope that even the natural greed and ambition that often propels our leaders might cancel each other out and work together for the common good. This new revolutionary system of government was buttressed by some of its central virtues which were widespread in society at the time. Now remember, a virtue isn't a value. We speak a lot today about values. Values may be shared, they may be adopted, they may be rejected, they may be good, they may be bad. But a virtue must be cultivated. It's a habit. It's a habit that forms the basis of behavior, and shared virtues are the precursor, really, I would maintain, of a free and civil society. Among the leaders of the day, and throughout much of our history as a country, we've had in place and shared widely some essential civic virtues, all of which I would say are there to generate enough trust among a lot of very different kinds of people to give us a chance at sorting out our differences. In no particular order, number one, honor the integrity of a handshake. Agreements, when they were written down, were meant to memorialize handshakes, which are exchanged among people of honor. Your word has to count for something. I know a lot of us still believe that, but it's not practiced widely today in our culture and certainly not in our leadership class. It's important, and it was believed at the time that it was important to see the legitimacy of your rival. That is, in debate, never question motives. Unless stated otherwise, operate on the assumption that you're both working toward the same good goal. That would prevent statements like, all my opponent wants to do is destroy this country. Third, forbear in using institutional prerogatives to maximize partisan advantage. A good example here in fairly recent history that many of you might remember are the two votes for Supreme Court nominees, Justice Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh, both accused of impropriety with women. Neither of those proved, both sitting today on the Supreme Court. But in the case of the Clarence Thomas vote, which was 52-48, there was no filibuster. There could have been technically a filibuster, but there was none. The filibuster would have forced a supermajority of votes needed to place Thomas on the Supreme Court. Senators then wouldn't have thought of filibustering this because senators believed that senators had to vote their conscience and had to have the prerogative of their own vote, and they wouldn't want to have watered down the prerogative of a single senator. By the time you get to Kavanaugh, it was already assumed that there would be a filibuster. Again, forbear in using institutional prerogatives to maximize partisan advantage. There were also some very widespread personal virtues among the citizenry at the time. Chief among those, self-reliance, that one took responsibility for one's own actions and one's own future. And the virtue of self-restraint, that is the ability to delay gratification. Think about the immigrants that came to this country, many of whom sacrificed a generation or two in order that their children might have a better future. Think of those who relentlessly pushed west and tamed a wild country at great risk and peril to build, again, something for the future. These were widespread, wide-held beliefs, the need and the supremacy of responsibility, self-reliance, and self-restraint. I think today, in our self-curated information bubble, we manufacture and reinforce our own truths, and we often give up seeking the truth. And I think that's one of the reasons everything's become so politicized. Everything's politicized. We are in a vigorous debate about the purposes of our government today, with larger and larger majorities willing to saddle the government with responsibility for manufacturing societal and even cultural outcomes. We've lost all capacity for civil discourse, and rather than unite us and find solutions, our politicians actively divide us. We no longer uniformly agree upon or teach essential civic or personal virtues. These profound societal and philosophical divisions have given us a legacy of deeply partisan politics that's propelled by a winner-take-all ethic. Up until very recently, maybe the last 15 or 20 years, most politicians would have agreed that you should never do anything really big in America, like, say, restructure the healthcare system or the tax code, without first achieving a large bipartisan majority in its favor. That's really practical politics in a large and diverse democratic republic. Change is not the goal in and of itself, but rather a nation more or less united behind the change. Back in the day, members of Congress had institutional loyalty to their branch of government and would, in bipartisan fashion, protect the prerogatives of the institution against incursion from another branch of government. That's actually the way it's supposed to work. Excessive fealty to party at the cost of fealty to our institutions undermines our form of government. Good example, at the height of his power, in the wake of a landslide election in 1936, FDR floated a plan to effectively pack the Supreme Court. He was deeply frustrated by it. The Supreme Court kept striking down elements of the New Deal, which he was, of course, passing to try to get us out of a Great Depression. That plan to effectively pack the Supreme Court was wholeheartedly rejected then by all the sitting justices and by the vast majority of both parties in Congress. Then the plan never even came to the floor. The branches protected their institutional prerogatives and saw that as a higher good than the immediate gain that might have been gotten by passing elements of the New Deal as FDR had proposed them. Today, presidents of both parties routinely co-opt the power of Congress with the support of much of Congress, usually from their own party. Let's fast forward now to more recent history, where I do believe we are at a unique moment that we need to understand to better comprehend our political choices. The pandemic that we're currently experiencing is the third great shock of this young century, and in many ways, it's the most significant. The first two were 9/11 and the 2008 financial collapse. I don't believe this shock has so much changed things as accelerated trends that were already long in the making. Principal among these is the collapse of the post-World War II security and economic order. In order to appreciate what's collapsing, you have to appreciate how it came about and how unique it was and has been in our history in human history. Before World War II, and really before the Bretton Woods Conference, where a lot of this was rolled out in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, there was global trade, but there was no global economic system. Following World War II, the United States made a really incredible strategic gambit. Instead of building a traditional empire, that is taking all of our defeated enemies and making them effectively vassal states and vassal markets of the United States, we waged peace by teaching the free world free trade. The basic proposition was this: look, we had the only Navy still afloat, and we had the only large functioning consumer market at the time. And what we said to all but who were removing themselves, like the Soviets, behind the quickly falling Iron Curtain, is that we'll protect all shipping worldwide, and we'll give you free access to our market, the largest consumer market in the world. And we created, along with it, an international integrated finance system with the dollar as the reserve currency. So instead of making wealth and security the central goal of the nation state, we made it a starting point and created an explosion of peace and prosperity all across the free world. The last 70 years has just been unparalleled in explosion of prosperity. Today, we're reassessing NATO and its security alliances. We're reassessing and questioning the benefits of international trade. Second big thing we're going through right now. The US and China are in a rivalry that has put us really on the foothills of a new Cold War. And this is, by the way, a bipartisan sentiment. There's bipartisan agreement that China played us and basically used the free trade and international economic order that we created to build enough wealth and enough military power to replace us as the most powerful and influential country around the globe. We will be dealing with China in an increasingly tense way for the foreseeable future. Number three, digitization. I think the past 5 months we've accelerated 5 years. That's significant, obviously, in our industry. It's also significant in our country because it's exacerbating the education gap. We've become increasingly knowledge workers, and there's a large cohort of the population that's left behind in that economy. I think we're in a period of massive shock and challenge to our institutions. Think about the movement to defund and redefine the role of police, the role of courts. The Federal Reserve is undergoing significant evolution. And the Senate is actively contemplating complete elimination of the filibuster, which really eliminates one of the last great minority checks on majority power. In addition, I think American-style capitalism is under attack from both parties. We are increasingly questioning the value of failure, and we're taking increasing steps to effectively eliminate the right to fail. That sort of heads us right into matters economically, and specifically, I think, by good example, the actions of the Federal Reserve. We came into this depression completely unprepared. Despite decent GDP growth, low unemployment, and strong wage growth, we accumulated an incredible amount of debt. Pre-pandemic, we had negative real interest rates and trillions of dollars on a Fed balance sheet. Following the Great Recession, and despite the largest economic expansion in our history, our monetary policy never normalized. So we really never reloaded the gun, even though we had the longest economic expansion in history. And as a result, the Fed's now crossing all sorts of red lines, including buying bonds from the state of Illinois, buying corporate debt. The Fed just squandered precious peace between the shocks. The only precedent going forward for what we're seeing out of the Federal Reserve today is the central bank intervention. In Japan. The Bank of Japan has been doing this for a decade longer than we have. The Bank of Japan actually has a 10% stake in the Japanese equity markets. So our economy today, 31.5 million Americans are now unemployed. About a third came back to work right after the economic shutdown. And we think another third will probably be back to work by the end of the year. But getting that final third back is going to take a long time. And I think by the end of the year, we're also going to see the face of unemployment change as the Fortune 500 starts to cull the ranks of their white collar workers. Our own economic views at First American are in line with consensus, which puts us at about probably 6 to 7% negative growth in 2020. Now, the good news for real estate, both commercial and residential, is that interest rates will remain extraordinarily low for the foreseeable future. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think that's a pretty good bet to take. The bad news for the country is that the 48% of Americans who own financial assets are doing well and will continue to do so. However, 52% of our fellow citizens don't own financial assets, and they are suffering. The dramatic moves that the Fed is taking really pump up the value of assets. And monetary policy actually depends on a type of trickle-down economics. And that's going to exacerbate political differences and social tensions. So it's against that backdrop, that historical backdrop, that situational backdrop, that we will elect a new president in November. And while many will point to the legitimate policy and style differences between the candidates, I'm going to start this phase of my talk by pointing out a few key things where they are similar. Neither Trump nor Biden is an institutionalist at this point. I actually thought Biden might be, but he's already joined those on his left calling for an end to the filibuster in the Senate, and he has hinted that he might be open to adding seats to the Supreme Court. While both candidates will no doubt tout a return to American values, neither appears particularly poised to lead a fight to restore either personal or civic virtue at the heart of the republic. Moreover, both parties are now aligned in their suspicion of the new international order, which the US imposed at the end of World War II, and are calling for degrees of withdrawal from the international scene. Biden probably less so than Trump, but in that he is also at odds with the left wing of his own party. Both parties have now embraced massive deficit spending and an extremely dovish Federal Reserve. So let's get down to basics here and take a look at who is best poised to win in the November election. The election, the first and most important thing to remember in an election where a sitting president is standing or running for a re-election is that it's never about the challenge. This is a referendum. It's a referendum on Donald Trump. What that means is that Joe Biden has a far lower bar to clear. He merely has to be an acceptable alternative if a majority finds Trump unfit for a second term. I'm going to go now to a couple of slides I put together because they convey a lot of information. And the first thing I want to look at is one of the most important and consistent predictors of election outcome in a presidential race. And that's presidential job approval ratings, generally expressed as unfav, or favorable, unfavorable ratings. What you see on this slide is that Bush Sr. in 1982, in June of the re-election year, was at a 37% approval rating, 34% approval just prior to the election. Look at that compared to Bill Clinton, who was, I think, 55, 54, 53, 54. Generally, you're going to see re-elects north of 50 historically, an approval rate. Obama's approval rate just before the election was 52%. Jimmy Carter, whom some of you may remember, one of the least popular presidents, was at 37% approval just before he lost his re-elect. If you could switch to the next slide. This is the history of Trump approval ratings throughout his presidency. It's really an accumulation of a mass accumulation and averaging of polls. What you see here is that Trump's at 41%. Approval and a 54, nearly 55% disapproval. Okay, two things that are different about Donald Trump and his approval ratings, and that is that his approval ratings, he's got a really, really hard, dedicated class of supporters. I mean, it's a very firm base. Not working on his behalf is the fact that among the disapproval ratings, those who will give a hard disapproval, mean I really, really deeply dislike the guy, is at 50%. What this means as a practical matter is that the election will be about turnout. If Donald Trump, if you're looking for a scenario under which Donald Trump wins, it's because there's underpolling, meaning people aren't admitting to the pollsters that they're really going to support Trump, and that people vote for Trump and come out to vote and turn in their mail-in ballots or get to the polling places with consistently more numbers than do those who in these polls are showing up as supporting Biden and disapproving Trump. Next slide, please. Here we see the polling in the swing states. And it's expressed in terms of net favorable or net unfavorable. So in the key swing state of Florida, you see Trump at -5. Now, does that mean he loses Florida? Absolutely not. That's a function of turnout. It's also a function of where Biden's numbers are. If you can make Biden an unacceptable alternative to many people, then that formula gets less predictive. The states that really matter here, in all likelihood, these are all sort of technically in play by an average of the polls, but you're really looking probably at Florida, you're looking at North Carolina, you're looking at Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and out west you're looking at Arizona. That's really where, if you're going to watch the returns, that's really where the election is going to be centered. Now, an important thing to remember about our process for electing a president, if you could switch to the next slide, please, is that our presidents are not elected by a popular vote. We were elected by the Electoral College. What that means, and just a quick history again for those of you who may have forgotten. So the number of electors in each state is roughly pegged to the population. And that is, it follows the number of members of Congress. So in California, where you have 55 electors out there, largest state by population, you've got 53 members of the House of Representatives and 2 senators for a total of 55 electors. The Electoral College in all but Nebraska and Maine is done on a winner-take-all basis. So, I mean, you can win by a couple hundred votes in the state of Florida, but you then get all 29 of their electors. That's why it's possible, and it's happened a couple of times in the last election, that you can have Hillary Clinton win the popular vote by 3 million and Donald Trump still win the presidency on the basis of the combination of states he took and the electors that they offered. The magic number is 270. What you can see at the top of this slide is a compilation of predictive polling outcomes. And what it does is it gives Biden a very, very probable 212 electors to start with. And it gives Donald Trump a very probable 115 electors to start with. We have a massive 211 up for grabs. But as you see from that basic math, Trump really has to get the lion's share of what's up for grabs, because he's starting 50% behind Joe Biden is an accumulation of probable electors. Last slide, please. I want to end here with just a discussion of the Senate, where I spent 6 years of my life working. The Senate's an incredibly unique institution for many, many reasons. And I think over history, it's done far more good than it's done bad. It's been it's been, if the House was set up, if the House is the place that reflects the will of the people and the passions of the moment, the Senate is the place where, because of the longer terms, 6 years, because of the staggered terms, only a third of the Senate's up every 2 years, bad ideas really get sifted, often get put on the shelf until the moment of passion has passed. So the Senate is where things cool down and where we take a longer view. It's very probable, if the Democrats take control of the Senate, that they will eliminate that characteristic of the Senate. That is, that they will eliminate the filibuster. So the Senate will go forward voting on legislation in all likelihood with a straight majority. That'll make it look a lot more like the House. They'll still have the elongated terms and the staggered terms, but it will become a much more impulsive chamber, particularly given politics today, where the members of the party tend to follow the leader of the party in lockstep, particularly if that leader is in the White House. Today, the Republicans control the Senate by 53 to 47. It's a slim majority. There are, as you can see from this chart, there are 9 seats in play this time. Bad news for the Republicans is that the majority of those are Republican-held seats. Now, in the past, the Senate has tended to follow the presidential, because our politics has become nationalized even at the local level. So the best bet is that if Joe Biden wins, then he sweeps in a Democratic Senate along with him, and we'll have a Democratic majority in the Congress as well, in the House and the Senate, giving him a majority in the Congress, and he'll have the White House. It basically gives him 2 years to do a lot of stuff before there's a referendum election, and you would see the voters with a chance to put a different political balance in place. Is there some chance that that the Senate stays Republican and that we get a Democratic in the White House? Absolutely. I think there's a cohort of voters, particularly suburban voters, who are really the key to this election, who may actually split their ticket and hedge. We'll see. But with that, I'd like to just take the remaining time we have here, about 25, 30 minutes, and just open the floor to questions.
Well, Kurt, it's John Wilson from Republic Title, obviously, and want to thank you again for an outstanding presentation. We've got a few questions that I can put in front of you. Let's start with this. It's apparently, fairly apparent that mail-in balloting will be a focal point over the course of the next few weeks. The Democrats are saying that it's needed because we are in the midst of a global pandemic. The Republicans don't want it because they argue it's going to present inherent cases of voter fraud. Can you explain for everyone the difference between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots, and what the potential implications could be if several states do opt to try to push for mail-in ballots?
I will, but not before I point out, just, your question, just one of the points I tried to make at the beginning of this presentation. Of course we're in a global pandemic, and of course people are going to mail in and need to mail in. And of course, if you mail in ballots, it's much more open to fraud. These things would seem to be obvious, and as a country, we should all be saying, yeah, that's the case, and we ought to work to make as credible and efficient an election as possible, given both of those realities. Instead, they have to become partisan realities, and they have to become at odds with one another instead of a problem that we work together to solve. That said, difference between the mail-in ballot and the absentee ballot. The absentee ballot, you have to go online. You have to request an absentee ballot, and so there's a lot more positive control over who gets the ballot. The fear with the mail-in ballot is that ballots themselves are just mass mailed, and so you've got addresses that are wrong. You've got people that have moved. You've got people who wouldn't go to the polls and whose ballot could be voted for them by somebody else. All of that sort of, and then you've got the Postal Service itself, which is supposed to, I think, you sort of cancel every letter and account for it, and then get it back to the electors in time in one piece. So there's a lot of, a mail-in ballot gets very squishy, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And in states like the state of California, which really won't be a factor in presidential balloting, but at the congressional level, there's something called legal vote harvesting, where you can go collect these ballots, and other people can bring the ballots into the electors on the day of the election. And obviously what that opens up is the opportunity for really organized ballot harvesting, go through a particular precinct, get everybody to put their ballots together, try to vote them all one way, find the ones that aren't being voted. Give me the ones for your kid who's just went off to college too. I'll vote that one, and let's get them all the electors on the same day. The fact of the matter is that there's a very good chance we won't know who's been elected on election day, because there's going to be so many mail-in ballots, and it's going to take a while to count all of them accurately. And if it's a close vote at all, there's either side's probably going to have some basis on which to allege fraud.
So it sounds to me like there's a very distinct possibility that we could be seeing contested election results when this is all said and done.
We could. Right now, if the polling's accurate, and remember, this is Donald Trump, so we learned in 2016 you can't trust the polling when it surrounds Trump. Yeah, right now it looks like he's getting swept. Right now the numbers say this is going to be a blowout. And it's going to be a Biden presidency with Kamala Harris as his VP now, as we all know today, and with a Democratic Senate and House. But you know, all the pundits have learned to take that caveat on there. But it's Trump, and also the other big but is that we haven't seen the debates yet, and the debates are going to play I think a very important role in people's final decision making.
Okay, another question here. You live and work in the district, so obviously you're around it all the time, and it's got to be a pretty abnormal environment in comparison to a typical presidential election year. What would typically be taking place around this time that you're not experiencing because of the circumstances that we're under?
Well, you know, let me just talk about the past several months. Normally, I would be meeting personally with members of Congress, senators, or their staffs multiple times a week, face to face. And I would also be meeting with other lobbyists face to face. That whole extra political social circle and that buzz has really disappeared. And so there's the information exchange has become much more narrow. And it's harder to figure out what's going on. It's harder to figure out who's doing what. It's harder to influence outcomes. It's harder for members of Congress to talk to one another. In the House of Representatives, they've had so-called proxy voting for a while now, where large numbers of members of Congress don't even show up. They can give their proxies to one of their colleagues and stay back home. So the decision-making has really defaulted to a small handful of leadership in both parties. Very few people around the table. That's a long trend that's been happening for a while. That concentration of power in leadership. I don't think it's a good one, by the way. I'm happy to speak more to that if people have questions or interest. But so that's all changed. The other big thing that's obviously going to change going forward is that we're the significance of the conventions is just going to be obliterated this year. Neither Trump nor Biden will even go to their conventions or really even have them in a traditional sense. Again, that's though more the acceleration of a long dominant trend rather than than something brand new. COVID's just accelerated sort of the demise of the importance of the convention.
Okay. Question from a participant here: Is it not true that Oregon mails ballots to all registered voters with little to no fraud?
I haven't seen any of the studies lately on Oregon. Look at, it's very possible to do a mail-in ballot with little to no fraud if the citizens aren't fraudulent. I mean, if everybody's exercising self-governance, if everybody's trying to do the right thing, you aren't going to lose your ballot. You're not going to give it to somebody else. You're going to faithfully vote it. You're actually going to get it in on time. You're going to get it on time for the electors to have a chance to vote it. So is this possible? Absolutely. Let me reference something I said earlier, though. What really makes our government work is not the justice of our government, but the justice of our people who operate our government, the virtue, the decency of the people in running our corporations, running our institutions, running our state and local government, our regulators. It's what people bring to these institutions that makes the difference in their success or failure. So really, if we have a lot of fraud, it may be a measure of us more than of anybody else.
All right, another participant question here: How would a Biden presidency, pull us away from NATO and other long-term global security arrangements?
So my pitch to you on this was that that was already a big secular movement, meaning nonpartisan, sort of apolitical movement already underway. that movement away from the world order. We established the world order really as a very clever strategic move against communism. We didn't have a 2 million man standing army that we could place and fill the gap. So we decided to rebuild Germany and turn her into an economic powerhouse. Same for the rest of Europe. We decided if we could bind them together economically, they would be less likely to be at each other's throats and start World War III anytime soon. And we essentially were able to isolate communism because its control and command economy made it so poor that at the end of the day, it just couldn't keep up with the explosion of prosperity in the free world. I mean, you look at the end of the 50s, and South Korea was the poorest nation in the world after the Korean War. By the time the Berlin Wall falls, South Korea's GDP is greater than all of that of the communist world combined. I mean, so that system of government failed because it didn't allow for basically, it could never harness or even support free market capitalism. Chinese now have done something very different. They've basically kept an autocratic single party rule, communist rule in place, and they've allowed economic reform, which is sort of a new thing on the world stage. Now, I think Biden spent a lot of years actually on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and when I staffed that committee, my boss was a subcommittee chairman there at the time, and Senator Biden. I got to spend a lot of time with Senator Biden. Then that's like 20 years ago now, but the guy is an internationalist. I think believes in alliances and will probably certainly more than Donald Trump try to push us back toward to what we had with the new world order, the one that came after World War II. The tough thing is that Americans are just exhausted by war. I mean, we've become suspect of the amount of money we spend on foreign ventures. We've been the sheriff of this town for a long, long time, and we're just kind of tired of it. We want somebody else to be the sheriff, and that's kind of like a legitimate thing to say. And Europe is still resisting picking up the responsibility for its own defense, say, or sharing that defense burden. I think Biden's long experience will probably put him, as the one pushing for more international engagement. You look at Sanders, though, and Sanders was right where Trump is. And so you could sort of say the left wing of Biden's party, if he's elected, will always be pulling him. The other thing we have to deal with in the international order, and it's just accept as a fact, is that when we created a big international marketplace, we exported a lot of manufacturing jobs. We just did. I mean, there's a natural sorting. There was a labor arbitrage done, but that's cost us what we pine for sometimes, which is a bunch of living wage jobs in America that can be done by people with a high school education. That's really hard to get in a world that's really defined by intertwined logistics channels and a lot of international trade. So that fact will also sort of weigh on Biden as he tries to set foreign policy, which is also always economic policy.
Let's talk briefly about Texas. You indicated in your slides that it is in play. However, in your presentation, I get the feeling that it's not as much in play. Is it realistic that, it hadn't swung Democratic since the Johnson days. Is it realistic that it could happen this year?
I think it won't. But you have to realize that the flip side of Texas being one of the fastest growing states in America is that a lot of other people with a lot of other ideas are moving into Dallas. And I expect the folks in Dallas and Houston sort of know that and feel it. Certainly you look down to Austin and you see a glimpse of the future. So where you have large populations, large cities, large metropolitan areas, large suburbs, there's just a broad secular trend toward voting blue rather than red. Is Texas there yet? I don't think so. I think the talk of Texas in play has actually been a very effective and clever tactic by the Biden team, which spent very little money on some suspicious polling and got the media to take the bait and write the story. And sometimes these stories get to be self-fulfilling, and that's why you get them out there. That's why there's incentive to do it. But I don't think this election.
Gotcha. All right. Our final question: what can we expect from the campaigns this year, given the likely lack of low in-person campaigning and the fact that none of these guys studied and girls studied pandemic campaign strategy in college?
Yeah, great question. Hey, look, we're all making it up. I mean, we're making it up in our business, and it's gone surprisingly well, I think, for most of us. I suspect the election will still go surprisingly well. What you're seeing money spent on now, and by the way, money is just flushed through the system at a pace that we couldn't have imagined even 10 years ago, on both sides. And you're going to see a lot of it spent on social media. You'll see you're going to see targeting of distinct groups of people and distinct demographics and distinct geographies, peppered through their own unique media channels with very specific messages designed to get them personally to get out and vote. Just like I got an advertisement the other day from a company that somehow basically knows my size and even has a pretty good idea of the type of clothes I buy. Not anymore, because I run around in sweats most of the day. I hope you guys like this collar shirt. I put it on for you. But wow, there's so much information available now to marketers that what we're going to see in this election is the power of that kind of personal curated information being hit to targeted voter groups in order to get them to either mail in their ballot or turn out on election day to vote.
Well, Kurt,
and then last thing, and then the debates. I have to say the debates are really going to be consequential, mainly because there's so much. I think there's so much question floating around Joe Biden, real or unreal, legit or illegit. There's a lot of questions floating around whether Biden's got the mental competency to really be the leader of the free world at age 77 for the next 4 years. I think that's probably going to be measured during the debates. You see the New York Times already laying out arguments that Biden shouldn't debate. And by the way, he shouldn't. I mean, if he really wants to just win, because he's got a lead. It's like, go sit on the football. You've got a 3-touchdown lead. Try not to turn it over. Try not to do anything bold. Getting on the debate stage with Donald Trump means he's going to have to stand up and go to at least a run-pass option offense. So no one will know what that means, by the way, another year from now, because we won't have a football season. But yeah.
Now you're speaking the language of most of our participants there, Kurt. Hey, I want to thank you so much for your time, and on behalf of everyone at Republic Title, I want to thank Kurt for lending his wisdom to all of us, and to each of you who joined us this morning. We cannot thank you enough. We know these are extraordinary times and extraordinary circumstances, and we have been very fortunate. We're managing to get deals closed for many of you, and to those of you who have been able to get your deals closed in the last few months, we cannot thank you enough, and to the extent that we can help you in the future, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Kurt, thanks again. A great morning, and take care.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, folks, for your business.
Yep.
God bless.